Welcome to In This Mad World with Andrew Marshall and Chelsey G, looking at the world beyond the headlines. So we're recording this on September 28th.
Yeah.
Yesterday, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the militant group Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, was assassinated by Israel in the Dahiya district of southern Beirut.
This is Israel, who can't seem to help kill civilians in Gaza, which is like the size of Chicago. But they were able to assassinate.
They're always very upset about it. They say so themselves. While they massacre untold numbers of civilians. So up to, basically on October 8th of 2023, last year, the day after the October 7th attacks, Hezbollah began firing rockets towards Israel from Lebanon the day after these attacks, and that began what's called sort of low-intensity conflict between the two sides. Hezbollah did this in solidarity with the Palestinians and Hamas, which is an ally. Both of them are also backed by the Iranian regime. But over the previous 11 months, so up until about 2 weeks ago, or less than, about like a week to 10 days, the back and forth conflict between Hezbollah and Israel has been overwhelmingly, like, obviously, not, surprisingly, the Israelis have been using the overwhelming amount of firepower. So in those basically 10 and a half months, 11 months, I believe Hezbollah fired about 1,000 rockets compared to 8,000 strikes from Israel. And there had been 28 Israelis killed in those 11 months compared to just under 800 Lebanese. So that's one Israeli killed for every 30 Lebanese killed, one Hezbollah rocket for every 5 Israeli missiles. And then we got to the past 2 weeks. So in the last half of September, when you had increase in assassinations of political leaders in Hezbollah, and then you had the pager attacks and the walkie-talkie attacks, thousands of people injured, dozens killed, including children and just random civilians. And then you had increased strikes, and then the massive day of bombings in which over 500 people were killed across Lebanon, in southern Lebanon and Beirut. And then you had the massive strikes just yesterday in the Beirut suburb of Dahiya, where they bombed 4 apartment complexes with 80 bombs in a matter of minutes.
Oh my God, it's so crazy, man.
And Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah since 1992, when the previous leader was assassinated by Israel, is dead, along with also an Iranian military official who was also there, and numerous others and civilians as well. Israel even reportedly used a 2,000-pound bunker buster bomb, or several of them in the area. That's according to the New York Times, which analyzed video footage. So that's where we are at this moment. You have this massively escalating war on the north, distracting people from the still ongoing war in Gaza and the still ongoing process of colonization in the West Bank. You have the Houthis in Yemen announced that they would be stepping up and increasing their attacks against Israel. The Iranian regime, which still hasn't responded to an assassination of Hamas's political leader in Tehran, in Iran, a few months back. They still haven't responded to that. And now their top ally in the region was just killed, along with much of the leadership of the organization. So it's not finished. That's not how these organizations work. You can't just decapitate them and they're done, but you can put them into disarray, and they have definitely done that over the past 2 weeks. So and you've had strikes, Israeli strikes in Syria, and then missiles coming from various resistance groups in Iraq towards Israel.
Yeah.
And so you have this just growing crisis in the region. You have the U.S. sending more soldiers to the region again, more weapons as well to Israel to continue with its multi-front massacres now. So this is basically where we are right now. So yeah, it's pretty scary situation.
Yeah, it's frightening. And it's just sad to see like all these families just completely displaced again, and it's like, how is like nobody intervening? It's just like this is so crazy.
250,000 displaced in Lebanon now in the past week.
And they're just still bombing them.
Oh yeah, big time.
It's like happening as we speak.
And this is after Israel added one of its original war aims to return Israeli citizens to the north of Israel, where 60,000 Israelis had left towns and villages along the northern border when Hezbollah began its rocket attacks in October.
Yes.
So, and they've laid the groundwork now. They added the return of those citizens to northern Israel as a war aim, and therefore that expanded their war in Lebanon, because that means that they want to push Hezbollah back far north of the border, if not decimate it. And so it's but
what they're going to aim to do is take Lebanon.
Well, if not necessarily take, but they definitely, like, they've been pushing some maps. Israel Katz, who's the foreign minister, released a map that showed a quote-unquote buffer zone, basically up to the Litani River in Lebanon, which was the previous area that Israel occupied in the 80s. Israel occupied southern Lebanon for about 18 years.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a repeat of that. And that ultimately, of course, didn't work. So I guess they're trying that again.
It's like, this is crazy.
Yeah. And we're just sort of like repeating history, but making it worse as we go. So
yeah, it's like you
learning all the wrong
anything.
lessons. We learned, but we learned the wrong lessons and are applying those.
Yeah.
So it's just more violent and more destructive.
Yeah, it's tragic, really.
And, there was the one day of bombings where you had nearly 600 people killed. That was probably the largest single casualty day, at least since Lebanon Civil War, which went from 75 to 1990 and was very violent. But potentially the most deadly day ever for Lebanon. So in terms of warfare.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is where we are at the moment. So I guess it's important to go back a little bit to understand how we got here and where these things came from. Because that's also left out of the context a lot. Over the years, I've had, more than a few conversations with Zionists and, apologists for Israel and its actions and its history, etc. And there's always like the usual wars that come up. They'll talk about the 48 war, they'll talk about the 1967 war, the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur war. And then they generally just jump to whatever present day war we were talking about, usually back in 2021 or 2014.
Yeah.
The Gaza wars, right? But they generally always skip over the Lebanon War in 1982. Within Israel, this is often viewed as sort of Israel's Vietnam. It's what they call like the war of choice, as if their previous wars weren't wars of choice, but this is even within Israel.
Such choice wording.
Exactly. Like war of choice basically is just another way of saying war of aggression. Because they mean the exact same thing. But this is this was a war launched by the first Likud government in Israel. And Likud is the right-wing party that Netanyahu is now the leader of.
Yeah.
Back then, it was headed by Menachem Begin, who was a former terrorist leader of a Zionist terrorist group called the Irgun, back before Israel was founded.
Yeah.
And so he was prime minister, and then his defense minister was Ariel Sharon, who was a general and involved in every war since Israel's founding, and was nicknamed the Bulldozer because he was particularly brutal towards the Arabs, which is what everybody just called the Palestinians. They don't use the word Palestinian.
And still to this day, that's how they refer.
Yeah, that's how a lot of them refer.
Yeah.
Like even back in the day in the 70s, you had Golda Meir, who was prime minister and the first, female prime minister of Israel, and was kind of beloved. She was a labor leader, so like in the diaspora where it's largely liberal, left-leaning, she's praised basically historically, what a great leader, blah blah blah. But back in the day, she even had quotes where she said, what's Palestinian? There's no such thing as Palestinian. I'm Palestinian. They never existed.
I'm a Palestinian. From 21 until 48, I carried a Palestinian passport. There was no such thing in this area as Jews and Arabs and Palestinians. There were Jews and Arabs.
Which is basically what you hear from ministers like Bezalel Smotrich today.
It's just so crazy.
No such thing as a Palestinian. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. Do you know who's Palestinian? I am Palestinian. My late grandfather, who was 13th generation Jerusalemite, is the true Palestinian. The Palestinian people are an invention that is less than 100 years old.
Yeah, and that was considered just normal. Like they would never use the word Palestinian unless it was just, sardonically referring to themselves. But nevertheless, so you had Ariel Sharon, defense minister, brutal war criminal, Menachem Begin, prime minister, former terrorist, both Likud party members, under guise, it was some concocted BS assassination attempt in London, I believe, in 1982, where it was like, it didn't even involve the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was like the Palestinian resistance against Israel and occupation and everything. It was used to be based out of Jordan, and then was kicked out of Jordan, and then was based in southern Lebanon, where you had big Palestinian refugee populations, because in 1948 the Nakba, which was Israel's founding war, also was big ethnic cleansing operation against the Palestinians. So 100,000 Palestinians were pushed out of former Palestine, then Israel, into southern Lebanon. Yeah. So then they built refugee camps, and also eventually became a base for the PLO and its resistance efforts. So that was Israel's actual motivation in going into Lebanon, was we want to destroy the Palestinian resistance. They had, a base in Beirut. They had refugee camps in Beirut and refugee camps all across the south, which became good recruiting grounds for the resistance groups. So that was Israel's true war aim. To kind of smash them and get them to destroy the threat. So they went in, pushed up into Lebanon. They went right up to Beirut. Obviously, everywhere they went, committing mass atrocities, bombing hospitals, ambulances, first aid workers. This was all very well documented, incidentally, by Noam Chomsky.
It's so crazy to me that they did that again, that they went for health facilities again. Get out of here.
That is...
Forbes, go! Now! Go! Forbes, that's it. You're going to your room, and I'm going to take your iPad away. Then go out of here now and go sit down and wait for Dad. See you later. Okay, thank you.
See? Never happened.
Never happened. Okay, see you later.
See, wait, my daddy fights.
Nightmare. Just taking my wallet, taking all the cards out, and then he goes,
Oh my
"Never
God.
happened."
You're like, I wish that's how debt works.
Yeah, like that's not true at all.
Yeah.
Nightmare.
There's a digital footprint, Forbes, in case you didn't understand.
He's such a nightmare.
That is Chelsea's son, by the way.
Yes, that is my son.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about how they made it up to
Beirut, yeah. And
Beirut.
we're like destroying hospitals, destroying everything, a lot of the infrastructure along the way. In his book on the subject, Noam Chomsky, it's called The Iron Triangle, actually goes like for basically a whole chapter, goes through all like the targeting of hospitals and medical infrastructure, which is just like very reminiscent of everything we've seen in the past year, but just as evidence that this is not a new technique of the Israelis, and they use the same lines, always human shields, and
They're just like
hiding
so
everything.
wild, man. Like the fact that this is just like typical for them is so like, oh,
Typical, but like on meth and like accelerated to insane degrees. Like it's the same kind of behaviors, but just like extra psychopathic.
yeah.
And
Some
just
steroids now, and it's just like
unhinged.
Unhinged is the best word possible.
Yeah, they're just full-blown fanatical lunatics at this point. So while they took Beirut, they also allied with these various like right-wing Christian Maronite militias known as the Phalangists in Lebanon. That was kind of their neo-colonial allies that they were hoping to put into power so that they could have a puppet government in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And then, pull back closer to the southern border. So they allied with these brutal militias that made the IDF look like what they claimed to be the most moral army in the world, right? Like these guys were even more brutal.
Oh my God, I didn't even know that was possible.
Right.
These poor people that were in this war path, man.
Oh yeah, just ruthless. And so this was this famous double massacre where the Israelis literally sitting in watchtowers overlooking these two refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in Beirut. They opened the doors and let these Christian militias go into these camps, which were for Palestinian refugees. And they basically just massacred women and children. And hundreds, if not thousands, were killed. And the whole time the Israelis just watched it unfold and allowed it to happen. And it even led to mass protests in Israel against the government and against the war, which developed the movement known as Peace Now, which today, it used to be something significant, and today is basically a pittance of what it used to be, because there isn't really a peace movement in Israel. Maybe that's changing, but we can get to that later.
Yeah.
And so that also led to the resignation, or rather the firing, of Ariel Sharon as defense minister. And there was a government investigation that placed the blame for the massacres on him. And he had to leave government. Everybody thought he was gone forever politically, but eventually he came back in 2001 to become prime minister again, or for the first time. But following these massacres, and then after several weeks of brutal war, the Israelis left Beirut. They pulled back down to the southern part of Lebanon, where they maintained an occupation for about 18 years. But in 1985, like they basically expelled the PLO from Lebanon, so it had to go to Tunisia, across the Mediterranean Sea to North Africa, much further away from Israel, not a neighbor.
Yeah.
But then they created this whole vacuum, this power vacuum in Lebanon. And all of a sudden, by 1985, you had this new Shiite, which is another sect of Islam. You have Sunni and Shiite as the two main sects. and this Shiite organization formed, known as Hezbollah, or Army of God, and they formed specifically to oppose and resist the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. So that was their whole, what's called a raison d'etre, like the reason of state, their reason
Yeah.
to be, to exist, their whole purpose. And they made the Israeli occupation so tenuous, because they did resist quite effectively, that eventually in the year 2000, the Israelis withdrew from southern Lebanon, but always maintained designs on it and always had to plan for eventual re-engagement, more war, more conflict, and obviously Hezbollah would be their big enemy.
Yeah.
Because they can defend themselves. Because not Lebanon, the Lebanese army is nothing. It exists, but it's like nothing compared to Hezbollah, and like it's basically 100%
It's so
dependent on the
crazy.
US.
Like it's so crazy that this like other group has like surpassed the actual like Lebanese military.
And it's a powerful political force in Lebanon. It's a political party. It's in the government. It's in various ministries. It's represented from top to bottom in society. It's not beloved by the majority of Lebanese. It's very specific. It's representative largely of Shiite groups, where Lebanon is divided between Shiite, Sunni, and Christian for the most part. Also Druze community. Like they have different sects, and that was the divisions in the Civil War from 75 to 1990. But nevertheless, everybody in Lebanon is even less of a fan of Israel and its tendency to bomb them and occupy them and invade them. And that's not surprising, because people tend to actually get upset when they're murdered.
Yes, 100%. Fairly so.
And tend to remember when that happens. Which brings us to the 2006 war on Lebanon. This I remember quite well. We were, so this was like a year after we graduated high school. So I was about 19. This is when I first started paying attention to Israel. And when I first started to notice and to like start to learn, or to try to learn about that country and what's going on in that world. Because I remember watching CNN and seeing this 34-day war unfold, and I was just like, what the hell is going on? And it clearly looked disproportionate. Like you just see all these massive explosions all over Lebanon, and then rocket sirens in Israel. And there's like this major disparity, because Lebanon was brutally crushed by this massive power backed by the US, which is the world's strongest, most militaristic power ever known. And that's just kind of opened the door for me. But that war began with Hezbollah kidnapping a few Israeli soldiers, though the Israelis...
Yes, like 4 soldiers, right? 2
of them, I believe.
Okay.
Although there may have been more that they added on in the days after the first one. But there was a later government investigation, I think it was called the Winograd Commission, following the war, to investigate its failures, in which the Israeli prime minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, who you'll see on TV a lot, like denouncing Netanyahu, but I'm like, I know you're a war criminal. Like, oh wow, war criminal denounces war criminal. How novel. It's like when Dick Cheney came out and voiced support for Kamala Harris, and
even
Jon Stewart clip was like
Payne, who's like, I can't endorse Trump anymore. Like he's a bad person. It's like, dude, you were like right there with him.
Who is this?
The guy who was like vice president for Trump. He like is like turned on Trump. I'm like, dude, you were his best buddy. Like no one there's no apology you can give. It's gonna make you get out of this.
He was like his doorman or his footman.
He was an idiot.
Yeah, and then he almost got lynched by the mob that Trump unleashed on the Capitol.
Yeah.
And they were like, let's kill him. And that's what you get for loyalty to Trump, right?
Nightmare.
Exactly. But anyway, so Ehud Olmert was the prime minister, and he later told this investigative commission that Israel was already planning a war on Lebanon that summer. They just needed the excuse. And so they were kind of being deliberately provocative. I know, shocker for anybody who is familiar with Israeli tactics and politics, is that they're constantly inciting provocations with numerous different people or actors. So anyway, a pre-planned invasion was activated when Hezbollah kidnapped some Israeli soldiers, who incidentally were operating this area called Sheba Farms, which is technically Israeli occupied Lebanon or Syria. The UN later decided that it was occupied Syria, but at the time it was still contested between Lebanon and Israel and Syria. So it wasn't like they just purely invaded Israel. They invaded or grabbed soldiers from this Israeli occupied territory. Which,
it's like it
once again, of course,
but they're upset about it.
Yeah. Always occupying. So in response began this massive bombardment by Israel, not only of southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is largely based, towns, villages, cities, but into Beirut, the capital, and particularly the southern neighborhood of Dahiya, where Hezbollah is largely based out of. They targeted civilian infrastructure across the country. They blockaded the port, so nothing could get in or out. It was basically similar to the blockade of Gaza, but a country.
Yeah.
Instead of just like a sliver, an enclave.
Yeah.
Obviously,
so it's like so crazy because now it's like, and here we are again. Like, here we go.
Nearly 20 years later.
Yeah, and the US is like right behind them.
Yeah. Even though it's like they lied to us and they didn't tell us. Like the US claimed that the Israelis didn't give them warning of the Nasrallah strike and the massive bombing in Beirut. And maybe they didn't because, to quote Selena Meyer in Veep, those Israelis are a bunch of sneaky fucks.
Unfortunately, ma'am, the man we captured is not, in fact, Abdullah Saeed.
Do the Israelis know anything about this? Because they're a sneaky bunch of fucks.
Yeah, literally. That's such a good show.
Yeah.
Love it. And if you guys haven't watched that, you gotta watch that.
Oh my God, 100%. Israel actually issued a formal complaint about Veep and the show House of Cards because they both portrayed Israel in a more accurate manner. So they imagine actually issuing formal complaints about Netflix shows and like
so good
HBO shows. Yeah. So that should actually get you to watch them.
US and Canada would be fucked.
But so you have this massive war on Lebanon. Among the civilian infrastructure targeted were roads and bridges and water facilities and the electricity grid. So this obviously has hugely damaging repercussions, and the whole time they're using the same excuses like human shields. Hezbollah's, hiding missiles in grandma's
They're
basement.
inside the kitchens. They're inside of residential homes with missiles under the kitchen floors. It's like, oh my God.
As if like the Lebanese are like, oh my God, is that what that's been in my kitchen this whole time? Like, I thought that was just a support. I missed
that while I was cooking with my baby.
Yeah, like, oh, interesting. Is it a stove or a missile? I can't tell. But that's the Israeli line. Incidentally, after the 34-day war in 2006, Amnesty International, all the other big human rights groups went in to investigate the claims, as they do. And they found that there was no evidence for the human shields, no evidence for all these like missiles being stored in civilian homes and structures. Instead, they actually found that the weapons caches were either on the edges or outside of urban areas and villages.
Shocker.
Which makes sense though, because it's easier to hide them there. Like it's kind of hard to move missiles in and out of areas when you're like, hey, like, can I just get in your garage real quick? Like
literally, like I'm like, I don't even like, that's just insane to think about. Like they're not just like moving around with everyday people, like moving missiles from house to house. Like
and it's a little different than in Gaza, because of course Gaza is an enclosed like ghetto, and it's so densely populated.
There's tunnels like underground and stuff, which make complete sense. Like,
yeah, and you have the tunnels in Lebanon too, but in Gaza, it's like you have like the missiles are obviously going to be among civilian infrastructure because there's nowhere else.
Yeah, that's true.
Like you're in a large prison camp.
Yeah.
So everybody's like, you should plant your missiles somewhere else where we can like destroy them easier. But then they're like, so where? Like,
yeah, like where do you want us to go? Like,
you built a wall
closer to the Egyptian border, like closer
like,
to
there's
the
literally nowhere we can do this.
Occupying border you've placed on us along the side here, like to the ocean where you're shooting at us in boats. Like,
exactly. So, but Lebanon, it's bigger landmass. It's an actual sovereign country.
Yeah.
And they have a little more space to do that, but they still have a whole huge tunnel infrastructure, most of which they've built since 2006. However, there was still some of that back during that war.
Yeah.
So it was out of the 2006 war. Incidentally, you had how many Israelis died? I feel like it was about maybe 150 Israelis died during the war, and then 1,200 Lebanese. So
drastic number.
Yeah. Predictably disproportionate, as is typical with any conflict with Israel. They just need to, overwhelmingly kill the other.
Yeah.
But this created what became known as the Dahiya Doctrine, which was announced in 2008. And it was announced by a general, Major General Gadi Eisenkot, who is the head of Northern Command. And Northern Command is the Israeli military command that deals with the northern border along Lebanon. So if you see the Southern Command general deals with Gaza, and the Central Command military general deals with the West Bank, and Northern Command is Lebanon. So he at the time was overseeing the Northern Command post, and he would later become the IDF Chief of Staff, which is the top military position in the IDF. And so he had outlined in 2008 this strategy named after the Dahiya neighborhood in Beirut. And I have a quote here from him where he told the media, "We will apply," and he's outlining how the strategy, the Dahiya Doctrine, would be applied moving forward. "We will apply disproportionate force on it," any villages, any villages from which things are fired at Israel. "We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases." So he said that what happened in the Dahiya quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. That's what Eisenkot said. And the Dahiya district was flattened, just as it was the other day. And so it's essentially saying that if a missile comes towards Israel, any village nearby, we're going to completely destroy. So it's a doctrine of disproportionate force. And he added, "This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved." So this was announced in 2008. And effectively, this is actually an announcement of intention to commit war crimes, because one of the foundations of international human rights law and international law is that you don't use disproportionate force.
Yes.
Is that war is actually all about
here they are,
proportionate
the
force.
most army in the world.
And their stated doctrine is to commit war crimes.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've spoken occasionally, had like chats with this one Israeli who's left Israel a few years back, lives in the States, used to serve in the IDF, even served along like the West Bank or along the border of Gaza, had some experience. An intelligent person, like, is aware and opposed to occupation, which is more than you can say about most Israelis who are like, occupation, what? So we'd have some interesting conversations, but he was still under the impression that, can't believe the IDF would, commit atrocities because we were all trained on human rights issues. And like, that was part of our training, was to be aware of these things. But these are all non sequiturs, because it doesn't matter what the lower level people are fundamentally told in some of these training sessions. It matters what the higher levels think and do and order them to do.
Yeah.
And if the higher levels are all rapacious war criminals,
They're
and
gonna get
the
you to be
orders go on
surprised.
down. Yeah. And not to mention that the idea that the IDF has ever been the most moral army in the world, or
for
let
sure.
alone a
That we-
moral army, is just laughable.
Like,
And
social platforms is the worst thing that ever happened to this fucking army. Like, it's
Social-
like, yeah, like, no, like, just like Instagram, like TikTok, like these like moron human beings that are like thinking it's cool to post like videos of them like literally torturing Palestinians, or like making fun of them, or destroying their home, wearing their garments. Like, it's just like so disgusting.
yeah, and it really shows it for what, like, for all the propaganda that it actually was.
Yeah.
And all the lies that it was. It's just that before we had access to this, we were getting just one version of it.
Yes,
it was coming
exactly.
basically from the IDF on down.
Yeah.
Like in Israel today, and of course this has been the case for pretty much forever. But what the IDF says is reality. Like, the media just reports what IDF spokespeople say, and it's just reported as truth. Oh, the IDF said it. It's the most respected institution in Israel. Full stop. Like every poll will show that, and yet it's one of the most immoral institutions on this fucking planet. You know?
Yeah, it's like insane.
Like, I remember last summer, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I was explaining to her, or discussing rather, the Myanmar military, known as the Tatmadaw. And the Burmese military, Burma is Myanmar, Myanmar is Burma, kind of interchangeable. So the Burmese military is basically known as one of the most violent, dehumanizing, destructive, just nasty, brutish, awful, most reprehensible, disgusting militaries in the world. Has been accused of genocide several times. The Rohingya have been one of its big targets. It's all loves to commit ethnic cleansing, loves to massacre civilians, shoots children and babies, and has just like endless atrocities. And I was talking to her, and I was saying basically, like, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, makes the IDF look like its slogan for itself is actually true. Like most moral army, like, it almost makes it look like that. I can no longer say that. As recently as October of last year, that was put to rest. The IDF has long outdone the atrocities of the Tatmadaw in Burma, which is a military dictatorship that orchestrated a coup and has been crushing a revolution for the past 3-4 years almost. So the IDF is just unbelievably immoral, destructive, and the fact that there was ever anybody in it who could claim that it was moral. Maybe
like
that was their
that.
unit. Maybe their unit was pretty lucky and didn't have to go commit a bunch of war crimes. But
I've listened to a few like interviews like with IDF soldiers who have like left and then like ended up leaving Israel, and like the things that they say they've had to do, or even just like the moments for them where they're like, this is not right, or just like as simple as just like invading. Not simple, but it's like just when they're like told to just like invade a Palestinian home and set up camp in it for like 6 hours to 1 week, and they literally lock a family in a room.
Yeah.
And it's like this family can't do anything. They just lost complete control of their house. Like, and it's like they don't know how long they're going to be in there for. It doesn't matter what they need. They have to ask for everything. And then I'm sure they total the house before they leave.
For sure. And steal as well.
Yeah. It's like,
and
now like an army that believes raping is just a totally fair game.
Oh yeah, it's totally fun. Nothing wrong with that at all. And just for the record, we're referring to recent events from what is it, 2 months ago now?
Yeah.
Where there was an incident in which a Palestinian who was brutally raped with various objects in an Israeli prison was sent to the hospital with severe injuries, died in the hospital. But the IDF, basically the legal arm of the IDF, decided they were kind of afraid of all these growing, international arrest warrants for Israeli leadership and increased questions of genocide and war crimes. So they need to like appear to have some sort of rule of law in the country. So they issued arrests for the soldiers, the IDF soldiers at this prison who were doing all the raping and torture. And so you had military police show up to this prison to try and arrest these soldiers. And then that caused basically a riot because they posted it. The soldiers refused to go, posted it on social media. And then you had the right-wing politicians in Israel rally their supporters to go to this prison. They basically broke in and had a confrontation with military police. The soldiers were eventually arrested, and then they stormed the place where they were held and like broke into that place as well. And then at the same time,
it was so unhinged. Like, and it's like this is like this is supposed to be like a democratic spot, and it's like, look at what's happening right now.
And there were images from those quote unquote protests where you had Israeli politicians who were members of the Knesset, members of the parliament, giving speeches standing next to masked men with like M16 rifles in full army gear. Like, these are right-wing fascists.
Not a good look.
But a good look for them because they're rallying their base of right-wing lunatics. And then in the parliament, they had a discussion as to whether or not it was okay to rape Palestinian prisoners to death. And turns out, yeah, that's fine.
יש מי שבפרקליטות חושב שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו. הכל. הכל.
זה מה שרציתי.
הכל, האנשים האלה, אתה יודע מה עשו?
אוקיי.
מנו, טוב.
יש דברים שלא עושים.
So that was what Chelsey was referring to there. In terms of like
and just like so many more stories that have come out now, like since this has come to light, like it's very disturbing.
Yeah, and that was also incidentally all documented by CNN, New York Times, and Haaretz newspaper in Israel.
Yeah.
It's pretty much all out in the open. So the Dahiya Doctrine, disproportionate force, a doctrine of war crimes, statement of war crimes, was then almost immediately after its announcement, was almost immediately applied in Gaza at the end of 2008 and the start of 2009 for Operation Cast Lead, which was the first of, the subsequent 5 big Gaza wars up to the present. But the Dahiya Doctrine was applied, so they targeted the civilian infrastructure. They used disproportionate force. It was overwhelming force. Even the UN report, the Goldstone report that came out a couple years after that investigated the 2008-2009 war, cited General Gadi Eisenkot's quotes in the Israeli media about using disproportionate force and about the Dahiya Doctrine, saying clearly this doctrine was applied, and that implies that it targeted civilian infrastructure in order to basically demolish the enemy instead of just using the excuses like the public facing propaganda excuses of human shields and blah, blah, blah. And so the UN report stated that Israel deliberately targeted civilians. And so that caused a bit of a stir in Israel. They issued formal protests, of course. Just as Netanyahu the other day spoke at the UN and called it, what was it? A den of anti-Semitism.
Oh my God, it was so brutal to watch. It was just...
The singling out of the one and only Jewish state continues to be a moral stain on the United Nations. It has made this once respected institution contemptible in the eyes of decent people everywhere. But for the Palestinians, this UN House of Darkness is home court. They know that in this swamp of anti-Semitic bile, there's an automatic majority willing to demonize the Jewish state on anything. In this anti-Israel flat earth society, any false charge, any outlandish allegation can muster a majority.
And then he like left like he had like signs and like, oh my god, he was brutal.
And oh my god, his little pathetic posters that he always comes
beast.
with, and
it was like,
oh yeah, the curse and the blessing.
Curse and the blessing. That was it. I was like, oh my god, this guy's psychotic.
Yeah, and just
it's like I think he believes his shit. Like I think he believes his shit. Like he is like sniffing his own gas. Like he is like believing it. Like to be able to stand up like that and like have no shame.
I mean, he's never had any shame, and he is.
I know, like this guy is just an embarrassment.
He's literally like charged in Israel.
I feel like you should be embarrassed to like travel the world.
Well, hopefully at some point the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, actually issues, or ICC, sorry, the International Criminal Court, actually issues arrest warrants, because so far they've only issued a call for arrest warrant, which isn't the same thing. It's like announcing that you're going to announce. It's like engaged to be engaged.
It's like giving you a heads up, like, hey, we might arrest you.
Exactly. But they need to fucking issue those arrest warrants because this man is still free for some reason.
Yeah, he's psychotic.
And so he needs to be to have those arrest warrants issued so that any countries which are signatories to the ICC will then legally be obligated to arrest him if he enters their country, which will be great. Unlikely in many cases, but that would be an important legal step. And I don't like, what the fuck is the delay, guys? Like, get those warrants issued. Like, this man cannot be free. They just released an image of him while he was in New York for the UN General Assembly in his hotel room, where he was on the phone issuing the order to bomb Beirut. Yeah. So it's like, you have the evidence. There it is. There he is issuing this massive war crime, and they posted it where he's giving the order. Like, you don't always get like the actual, like, hey, here I am giving the order. Here's a photographic evidence.
Caught red-handed.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, guys, how much do you need to put this guy on the list? And his defense minister, Yoav Gallant.
Oh my god, they're all so terrible.
They sure are. They really, really are.
Okay. So I will say, like, now, obviously, like, ending on that discussion, I feel like it's a perfect segue into post-October 7th and, like, what's going on currently right now. But do we want to talk about, like, the build-up, like, to the present, or do you feel like we've, like, covered everything now? We got to, like, talk about, like, today's time.
Yeah, I mean, we, like, just a brief rehash, you know, you had thousands of rockets exchanged. It's usually in the media described as a tit for tat, back and forth, blah, blah, blah.
Like,
but
oh,
it's
look
like
at that.
80% Israel, 20% Hezbollah is really what it comes down to. For everyone is, and this is up until about 10 days prior. Again, we're speaking September 28th. So around up to September 20th, before this major escalation took place, you had just under 800 Lebanese killed compared to about 30 Israelis. So one Israeli for every 30 Lebanese, one Hezbollah rocket for every 5 or 6 Israeli missiles. And then you had the massive escalation, the assassinations of top leaders, the walkie-talkies, pagers, explosions, and then the massive bombings all across the country, killed nearly 600 in a day. And then the major assassination of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, just yesterday. And further bombings. And now, in the past 10 days, since this escalation, you've had over 1,000 Lebanese killed.
Yes, like, it's actually crazy, the number.
Yeah.
Like, and even if we were to just, like, look at, like, something to be going on right now, it would be that they're, like, incessantly bombing them.
Yeah. So you've had more Lebanese killed in the past 10 days than in the previous 11 months of war by Israel. So this is a dramatic escalation. Herzi Halevi, who's the IDF chief of staff, said, get ready for a ground invasion.
Oh my God.
And that seems to be what they're preparing for. The US and the UK and Canada and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and a few other countries all put forward this proposal. It was written by the Americans and the French to push for a 21-day ceasefire to stop this ongoing escalation in the north. Israel announced, what was the headline that I saw? I think it was either in the New York Times. I can't remember where it was, New York Times or Haaretz possibly, but where it said that Israel or Netanyahu agrees with the aims of the ceasefire.
Oh my God. He's so brutal. What is this? This is like 30th ceasefire that he's turned down?
Pretty much. So this was basically the 18th or 19th ceasefire that Netanyahu has fucked.
I feel like it's more than that now, but that's probably
potentially.
accurate.
But yeah, I mean, who can keep track? Like when you
he's so psycho.
Ruin more than 2 ceasefires, more than one.
Yeah,
you're kind of like peace is not the aim here. Yeah. And and of course, it should be pointed out that from the beginning, by which I mean from October 8th, when Hezbollah began firing rockets towards Israel, it made it very clear what it would take for them to stop. And it's very simple. It's a ceasefire in Gaza. Hezbollah said from the very beginning, we will stop firing rockets when you sign a ceasefire with Hamas and end the war in Gaza.
They're like, not today.
Yeah, that's the demand, the only demand. They're not saying like we want a buffer zone inside Israel, which is what
they're just like, please stop bombing Gaza.
Yeah, and then we'll stop. The Israelis, of course, reject this because they believe they have the right to continue their genocide and total destruction of Gaza and its civilian population. And now they, of course, want to expand their war aims into Lebanon.
Yeah. And just like even what they're doing in the West Bank, like
just a few weeks ago, massive war operations in the West Bank, killing hundreds. Yeah, Israel's just,
arresting hundreds, like children, women.
Israel's at its most psychopathic stage in its history, clearly.
I'm like nervous. Like it's like I feel like there's so many people like because they got into Jerusalem yet?
What do you mean?
Because you know how there's part of Jerusalem is also like where the Palestinians are.
Yeah, East Jerusalem.
Have they started to do these similar types of acts there as well?
Well, the Israelis claim all of Jerusalem. The eastern part is occupied. That was the Palestinian side. The Israelis have been building settlements in it for decades, since 67 when they occupied it. So there's always various conflicts, but Jerusalem is its like own enclosed universe. It's cut off from the West Bank, even though it's attached to it. It's cut off from Israel, even though it's attached to it. So to be a Palestinian in East Jerusalem is a different kind of world between being an Israeli citizen and being a West Bank resident under occupation. It's more the West Bank side.
Yeah.
Technically, they have, they don't have Israeli citizenship because Jerusalem was also annexed to Israel, I believe, in 1980. So they occupied it in 67 and then officially annexed it as part of Israel in 1980. But the Palestinian citizens of Jerusalem did not get citizenship. They got a special resident status, which allows them to vote in municipal elections, but not national elections. So they don't have representation in Israel because it's the most democratic state in the Middle East, which denies, 5 million people under.
But like settlers get more rights. Like
settlers live under, so they live in the occupied territories in the West Bank.
Under civilian law.
Under civilian law. Whereas the Palestinians live under military law.
Yeah.
And so when there's a conflict, if like Israeli settlers, go and kill some Palestinians, they go to civil courts.
Or if you
through the legal system,
you're going to like military court.
Yeah, and prison.
Conviction rate
as a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're lucky, because you might just be under administrative detention.
Prisoners, like in the world.
Sorry?
So they have one of the highest rates of child prisoners in the world.
If not the highest, I believe, actually. And increasingly so. And this is not a new phenomenon. This has been the phenomenon for years and decades. And very well documented by Israeli human rights groups. I highly recommend looking up Bet Salem is very good. There's a few other groups that have documented, that are very focused on documenting the occupation. There's, of course, numerous Palestinian human rights groups that have long been ignored that have been documenting it as well, and have more recently been, in past years, labeled as terrorist organizations by Israel so that it could destroy them and steal their computers and their operations. But yes, so all these things are going on simultaneously, and it also is kind of worth noting that on October 8th, so the day after the October 7th attacks, Israel was sending warplanes to go, like, they were immediately saying, yes, we're gonna, destroy Gaza, but let's also destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon while we're at it, because, two birds, one stone, two birds, one stone.
Yeah.
And
I also
Hezbollah,
feel like,
sorry,
I just feel like they always seem to have their hands in like two places. Like if they're not in Lebanon, they're in Syria. Like it's like they're always in Palestine. Like so it's like, do you know what I mean? Like if they're not over here doing something with like Lebanon, they're over here like messing with Syria.
Such is the struggle of an imperial power.
Yeah.
Like for that with Israel, like that's all true. Like it's, bombing Syria, sending bombs to Yemen, bombing Iraq, occasionally undertaking assassinations or bombing attacks in Iran, and bombing the fuck out of Lebanon and destroying what remains of Palestine and threatening everybody. Literally, when Netanyahu
have they ever
at
messed
the
with
UN,
Egypt?
back in the 48 war, the 67 war, the 73 war.
That's when they came to the agreement, right?
Yeah, following the 73 war, and then under the Carter administration in 78, 79, they signed the first peace treaty between an Arab state and Israel, which was with Egypt. And that treaty remains to this day, which, like, also how they divided, blocking off Gaza so that the Egyptians controlled the southern border along Rafah. But that agreement also meant that the Egyptian military would get billions of dollars in U.S. aid, U.S. military aid, every year in order to maintain that agreement. So it became a cash cow for the Egyptian dictatorship, which was a military dictatorship. And that made Egypt the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world. And of course, who's number one?
The United States.
No. The second largest recipient of U.S. military aid.
Oh, U.S. military aid.
So who's number one?
Israel.
Of course. By far. And then it would be Egypt. And sometimes, occasionally, like Colombia would be up there as well.
So interesting, because Colombia has been so vocal, like about like how they feel about Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that would be more recent. Colombia typically had like a little more centrist right-wing politicians in the past, and it was often like that was one of the other world's longest running civil wars in Colombia. And the US was giving them weapons the whole time, and displacing hundreds of thousands of indigenous communities inside Colombia.
They're like so upset. There's like this influx of refugees coming into the United States from South America.
Yeah, and
they're just like baffled that this is happening as they like claim that they're eating animals. Like it's like this, it's just like they're loony bin down there.
Yeah,
they're like
dealing with the repercussions of imperial foreign policies.
Yeah.
Western countries are not so good at it. We're fine with, same in Europe, where it's like you're fine to bomb Syria and Libya and Yemen and Somalia, and then soon as the refugees start pouring into their continent, you're just like, oh my god, our culture is under threat while you bomb their country.
Yeah, it's like you just destroyed their whole culture. Like it's like you literally went into their homeland and like literally destroyed everything, and then you were like, see you later, hope you guys can survive in the rubble.
Yeah.
Like, by the way, I destroyed every standing hospital and place that there's food, and like you guys have like nothing left. Like it's just not logical. Like it's like I don't get it.
That's Western hypocrisy, and it's an imperial mindset. We get to do what we want, but we'd really rather not face the consequences. So it's, what's that old saying? The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And but tends to be the way of the world.
And do you feel like that's like why Israel's going like so hard in like the tactics that they're doing? They're trying to like instill fear and like.
Yeah, so that basically gets into the rationales, right? Like, why is Israel waging war? Why is Israel escalating the war into Lebanon? And this is part of their overall military. Like we mentioned the Dahiya Doctrine, right? Which is like a strategy, really, of using overwhelming force against your enemies. But there's an overall military strategy, and this goes far beyond Israel. This basically goes to any major imperial power or semi-imperial power, which is the idea of deterrence. So deterrence is this word that usually just means fear. So the idea of deterrence is that you are such a powerful state with so much military firepower, capabilities, weaponry, etc., that nobody would ever risk attacking you for fear of what you would do to them.
Yeah.
So your arsenal,
You're flocking your feathers, like.
Yeah.
The
most famous example of deterrence is, I guess, to a degree, what was called mutually assured destruction, which was the doctrine between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War about nuclear weapons. So the idea that we have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear weapons, nobody's going to use them, because if any one of us uses them, then we're all going to use them and the whole world's going to blow up.
Yeah.
So we are all deterred by the use of nuclear weapons because we know what it means once we unleash that, genie. So in that sense, deterrence may have been effective in thus far preventing nuclear war. But Israel, strongly believed that it had very effective deterrence in the region, and that it was, nobody would basically fuck with Israel, etc. And then October 7th happened, and that broke the paradigm.
Yeah.
If Hamas, this little nothing group of like rebels from tunnels who flew over the fence and crashed through it in pickup trucks and cut through it and could do what they did on October 7th, then that sets back Israel's deterrent strategy, not only towards the Palestinians and Hamas, but towards all of its neighbors, towards Hezbollah, towards Iran, towards the Houthis, towards these rebel groups in Iraq and Syria. And so they felt that their deterrence paradigm collapsed. So they need to re-establish deterrence as a strategy. And that means they need to make everybody afraid of them again.
Mm-hmm.
So the best way to do that is to unleash your crazy. And in politics, this has also been referred to in the US as what it's like Nixon came up with. What is it? The madman theory. So, and Trump really embraced this in his one term as president, which is that if you make everybody else think that you're a total crazy person, then that will act as a deterrent against them to ever fuck with you, essentially.
Yeah.
Like Nixon was really good at that because everybody thought he was nuts and, didn't know what he would do in any sort of circumstance. And so you keep them on your feet, you surprise them. And that's basically your insurance policy so that people don't try to call your bluff, so that you get your way. You're basically a big bully who's crazy. And Trump did that. And Netanyahu
kind of like North Korea's leader.
Yeah, he definitely has some of that madman stuff, but you never
really know what that guy's got in his pocket because you just don't know what's going on in there.
Yeah, they're just such an isolated regime.
Yeah, it's like I mean, what's happening in there?
It works to a degree, but he's not very like North Korea isn't like Israel in terms of like they're actively waging war. I mean, technically the Korean War never officially ended. It was never declared ending. So it's this frozen conflict along the borderline.
Yeah.
And so they're technically both still at war, but it hasn't really been a fighting, shooting war for like 70 years. So slightly different scenario. Yes, he will like assassinate his siblings and family members and then, do like some crazy shit, like, you know, sending missiles over Japan and South Korea and showing how, like, that's establishing deterrence, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what North Korea does. That's what the nuclear program is. It's deterrence. Because, oh, we have nukes, so what the fuck are you going to do? You're going to come after North Korea now? We'd nuke Seoul in South Korea. What would you do then? So that's a deterrent strategy. So Israel's version of that is just using massive amounts of terror. They also have nukes and have threatened to use them, but they're not comfortable with that alone. They need to show force in a very...
And Iran has nukes too, don't they?
No, but they do have a nuclear program and are potentially inching closer and closer to that. There was an agreement negotiated by the Obama administration to end the threat of nuclear weapons and to allow for the Iranians to enrich their nuclear capabilities to a degree, but mostly for civilian use, so for like energy purposes. But Trump pulled out of that program. It was opposed by the Israelis from the start, and then by the Saudis and a few other, you know, awful actors. So basically the worst people in the region opposed the deal. So the Israelis and the Saudis, because they saw the Iranians as their main rival. Yeah. And this agreement,
they're like don't give them any boost. Like, we don't need that. They need to stay down.
Yeah. And Netanyahu had basically built his entire 15 years of being prime minister on the basis of Iran being the number one threat for Israel, and the whole reason for its military posture, and they were constantly threatening Iran and like really wanted to like sideline the Palestinians and not care about them. The real threat is Iran. Like, this has been Netanyahu's line for years and years and years, and he even had to be held back from bombing Iran a few times.
Like, what would happen if they bombed Iran?
I mean,
go off.
Yes, and that's increasingly possible if Iran gets more involved in the wake of this Lebanon escalation, which is fairly likely considering Hezbollah is their biggest ally in the region.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that would spark a major war. And we did see back in April when Iran sent, you know, those hundreds of drones and everything.
Yeah.
But
the U.S. kind of like stepped in, right? So then it was like all of a sudden the U.S. is like flocking. They're sending like ships over.
The U.S. shot down a huge number of those drones.
Escalation towards Iran. It's like that's like now it's not only are we like sparking a Middle Eastern war, but that's like getting you steps closer to like a world war.
Correct. Yeah. And Iran has long been on the U.S. list for, you know, imperial correction, let's say. Even the George Bush administration listed it as one of the three powers in the so-called axis of evil, the others being Iraq and North Korea. But Iran was the third one listed. And they did have designs at the time to have 7 wars in 7 countries, including Iran. They only got around to, you know, 6. But yeah, so the Israelis, I mean, their actions are definitely provoking Iran further. Iran and Hezbollah didn't want wider wars, which is why they've kind of like, you know, been more bellicose in their rhetoric, but then pulling back in their actions.
Yeah.
But them sending the hundreds of drones and stuff towards Israel, they advertised it ahead of time.
Yeah. They're like, hey, we're coming. Like, we're going to do this. Like,
yeah, they're like, get prepared to shoot it all down.
Here. But like, we're going to give you a huge heads up so that you can like do whatever you got to do to make sure that your civilians are safe. So it's like, and yeah, Israel would never do something like that. Like, they'd be like, boom, we're here. And we've killed 600 people already.
Exactly. Oh no, they send out
leaflets,
text messages.
Yeah, that might
which
blow up
of course goes over really well after you use pagers and walkie-talkies to explode human beings all over the country. So people get text messages from Israel and throw their phone across the fucking room.
Literally, I would be like, "What are you doing texting me?" Like,
yeah, it's pretty horrifying.
My phone's rigged. Look,
oh my god, yeah.
Where am I answering that? Could you imagine if like all sitting up here, we could just get like a text from like fucking Trump, like, come in,
Yeah.
Be like,
God.
be like,
Oh, he's
"What?"
lost again.
Yeah, he's lost it again.
Yeah.
He's put up the hedges. Like, God.
But oh well, so during the first days of the Gaza war, when Israel wanted to move into Lebanon, you had airplanes, jets on the way, and then Netanyahu got a phone call from Joe Biden,
Yes.
who
Being like,
said,
turn it around.
"Yeah, who said absolutely not. This is too much. Turn
Yeah.
those planes around, head back." And so Netanyahu did, and he pulled the reins on his generals and all the other politicians in the country because they were all on board for saying like, "Yeah, let's take out Lebanon. It's our bigger threat." Or Hezbollah, not Lebanon, is what they'd say, but it's
Yeah.
Lebanon.
Like, it's actually like so painful to like watch him talk about like Lebanese people, like as if he cares. Like, do you know what I mean? Like watching him at the UN like speak, like being like, we care. We're telling them to get out of there. Like it's like leave this area. Like it's like you don't care about them at all, man. Like you actually like don't give a fuck about them at all. Like this is offensive that you're even saying that.
It's like a serial killer
He's fucked.
who has somebody chained in their basement who tried to get away, and then he catches them, rechains them up, and beats them and tortures them, and says, I do this because I care.
Yeah. Like,
you make me torture you. You make me hurt you. I don't want to hurt you, but you make me.
Yeah.
Like that's Netanyahu. He's the serial killer, like
of
with
the
the
Middle
victims
East.
in the basement.
Yeah.
And pretending that he's trying to express human emotion, but doesn't quite understand it. He's a complete fucking sociopath. Again, where is that arrest warrant? ICC.
Ugh.
Get
It's taking
on
way
it.
too long.
Truly.
Got it.
So, okay, additional reasons, rationales for Israel to expand this war. One of the obvious ones.
To avoid jail. Avoid jail.
There you go.
Yeah.
Because since for almost 2 years, for actually like years and years, Netanyahu's been facing charges, including of lying, and corruption. Yeah.
Not Bibi.
Right. So he's facing all these charges, which means that in the event that the war ends, everybody knows that the day that the war ends, or the day after the war ends, Netanyahu's government is finished, and he will probably no longer be prime minister. The government will probably collapse.
Wait, he's gonna have to like fucking flee or something.
Yeah, and then he's afraid that he's gonna go to prison, either in Israel or facing international arrest warrants. So for him, the war is not a crisis, but an opportunity.
Like a survival technique.
Exactly. The longer it goes, the longer he stays prime minister, and the more he gets to gut the judicial system and protect his own power, the more he gets to cement his own power. Additionally, the extreme right members in his cabinet, specifically Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security member, psychotic settler, fascist, lunatic, Jewish supremacist,
he's like
nightmare. He is
I feel like his goal is like, I honestly feel like he would fucking kill Netanyahu. He would be like, let's get
100%.
rid of him, and I want to like take his spot. He is crazy. Like he is like actually like he should be looking out for him. Like it's like, you are my biggest threat.
Yes, and that's why he keeps him close.
Yeah, like not Hezbollah.
Netanyahu, I mean, 100% liar, total psychopath, everything, but he's not an idiot.
Yeah.
Well,
he's been playing longer, right? Like rubbing shoulders with bigger power. It's like he knows how to work a room of like people who can make big decisions.
He plays the game.
Imagine this guy coming to the UN. Imagine this fucking guy. Like he would be unhinged in there.
Oh,
like you think it's like already rough with like Netanyahu in there? Like imagine this guy. Like you'd be like the things people would be saying. They would be like, this is a joke.
And Ben-Gvir would treat the Americans the way he treats everybody, whereas Netanyahu like manipulates the Americans in the way that he does, and they just go with it. And they know they're being manipulated.
I don't know anymore with America. Like, because I feel like would they like, or would they just be like, well, this guy's the new guy, so better get on board.
With Ben-Gvir, you mean?
Like their narrative would just start to like align with his narrative. They just seem to be like the U.S. seems to be like showing more and more that they're kind of like puppets. Like they don't even have like they're so easy to do something.
I mean, I think, okay, so let's take a moment to actually like explore this a little, because it is a really important point that you raise, and it's something that's very complicated and something that repeatedly comes up in US geopolitics with different countries around the world.
Yeah.
It's the question of American influence. Right. So when you go back to the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and then you basically had America alone as the only superpower in the world.
Yeah.
So America's power was basically
huge.
Yeah, it was
They were
huge.
super influential.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was very, very challenging for any countries to say no to America on pretty much anything, because they had the economic might, the military might, the diplomatic might. Russia was in tatters. China was still like getting its economic shit together. It was not a great power yet. The only other big powers were close allies of America's that it basically had in its pocket. So, you know, it was kind of their height of power. It has since declined precipitously as other powers have risen up. China, Russia, the former third world countries, Brazil and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and all these countries, India, countries that are
like they all have like fucking crazy fanatic leaders that are just like nut bars.
Right.
That are what's that word? Deterrence. Like they're like out there like being fucking crazy and doing crazy ass shit. And you're like, oh, like you like look at Russia and like Putin, you're like, fuck, this guy's like KBG or whatever he was. Like
KGB.
He was like frightening. Like he might like tomorrow what's legal today will not be tomorrow because he like sneezed and it went left. Like he's gonna be like, nope, terrorist.
Yep, pretty much.
My own sneeze is a terrorist. Like it's like give it like poison and kill it in prison. Like he's frightening.
He loves that. It's his favorite.
It's his favorite way of oh, and then he's like, oh, what a mystery.
Yeah.
How did it happen? And then you know nothing about his life. He's a mystery. He's like an enigma. I was like, where's his family? Like I feel like he's so sneaky.
He is a sneaky fuck.
He's a sneaky fuck.
Yeah.
Like Veep would say. Look,
exactly.
It's like you think Israel sneaky? That's a sneaky motherfucker.
Yeah,
and I'm like, he's just up there watching this, like being like, look at these messy fuckers. Look at these messy fuckers. Like, he's like, they're so messy. Like as he's like shirtless, like taking his next photo to like put up in all the fucking places.
Right.
on a horse.
Riding a horse.
Yeah. Like so insane. Like, oh, he's like one where I'm like, why is no one watching? Like it's like this is like such a show, and he is just like, keep it going because I'm building up over here.
Well, I mean, eventually under Putin, Russia learned to start saying no to America and pushing back.
Yes.
Which is part of their decline in those terms. But so Israel was always like the closest ally of the U.S. and they would have conflicting, challenging relationships.
But that's like let's just like stop there for a minute. Like, why is that? The U.S. made them.
I mean, to a degree, like Israel was a group project. So you had the British.
Yeah, when you're like in college and they like pair you with like other partners, and you're like,
my nightmare. I hate it.
That's what Israel is. It's like it's the birthing of a group project that everybody hated to be a part of.
That's actually a pretty spot on way to put it. Actually,
it's like we're like presenting in front of the class. Everyone's upset about it. Like no one likes it. Like they're like, get it out of here.
Israel is a group project between the Western imperial powers. So obviously the UK started that project, with the Balfour Declaration, 1917, supporting Zionist migration into country. This is all before Israel existed. So the first half of the 20th century. And then after Israel was founded, its top military backer became the French, but its top economic supporter became the Germans. And the Germans built up Israel big time. The French, built up its military a little more. They both possibly contributed to helping develop nuclear weapons. And then after the 1967 war, then the Americans came in and said, oh, we see that you're actually pretty good at kicking ass. And we're looking to, have a little more power in the region. So you seem like a really helpful cop on the beat, on the local beat that we could arm and build up. Exactly. And so basically, like, you are an imperial outpost, which is also how Israel also presented itself to Europe and the West. It said, support us. And you hear that today. Like when Netanyahu talks, he says we are we are part of Western civilization. We are the outpost. We are on the front lines of the Western civilization. We're fighting the barbarians, blah, blah, blah. All this bullshit rhetoric, but it reveals that actual inner truth of Israel, that it is an outpost of the West, that it is an outpost of Western colonial structures and ideas and systems in a region that the West has sought to exert its power and control and dominance.
This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. It's a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together. This is a battle between the forces of civilization and really monstrous barbarians who murdered, mutilated, raped, beheaded, burnt innocent people, babies, grandmothers. This is a test of civilization, and we will win. And we are not fighting just our war, we're fighting the war of all civilized countries and all civilized peoples. And just as the civilized world united in fighting the Nazis, united in fighting Daesh, ISIS, then the civilized world should unite behind Israel in fighting and eradicating Hamas. I have a message. I have a message for President Macron. Today, Israel is defending itself on 7 fronts against the enemies of civilization.
And so it is this joint project between all these countries. The U.S. since 1967 has become paramount, far and above. If you look at any graph of countries that arm Israel, 70, or I think it's like 68 or 67% of weapons come from the United States, and then nearly 30% come from Germany, and then a few percent come from Italy, and then like the last couple percent just comes from basically all the rest of the Western countries, including Canada and the UK and France. But it's the US and Germany are the two big guys, and the US far and above, plus all the diplomatic immunity at the UN, vetoing all the resolutions against Israel, providing all of the diplomatic cover. So I don't really think it's fair to say that the US is a puppet of Israel.
That's fair,
the US gets played, sure.
Yeah.
And they also, it's a back and forth relationship, but the US also lets themselves get played, and they also publicly do so. So the fact is that we don't know what's being said behind the scenes. We have leaks.
That's true. And it's like just so odd that they're allowing it to like publicly happen. Like maybe there's more to it like that we don't know.
That's usually the case.
Yeah.
Like, from a historian perspective, you go through like all the records of declassified documents, and you have the conversations between the leaders who are making the decisions, who are rationalizing their decisions, and the rationales that they give are often very different from what they then go say publicly, which is more for like the wider public consumption, the domestic consumption. But perhaps their reasoning behind closed doors is a little more related to just power and very strict state interests, rather than flowery language about civilization and democracy and things that they don't actually talk about that much behind closed doors.
Yeah.
So I think that's at play. Obviously, we don't know the true conversations. I think it's very obvious that the US has put pressure on Israel to change certain things, like what I mentioned before about turn the planes around, you're not bombing Hezbollah, Lebanon today. That's an example.
And I think too, like the US election coming up is going to be pivotal in like what happens next. Like it's like depending on who gets in, it is going to be kind of like the telltale of like where this is going to go, whether it gets more vicious or whether there's a bit more restraint from the United States side.
I think either way, whoever wins, it's going to get more vicious, because so after Obama won in 2000, at the end of 2008, that's when Israel began Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, this massive war, and they finished it just days before he was inaugurated as president on January 20th, 2009. And it was kind of like this whole setup. So the first thing, this was also incidentally the worst of the global financial crisis, September, October 2008. And so Obama came into office having to deal with the financial crisis and Israel.
Yeah.
Which also reminds me, incidentally, speaking of Veep, of that quote where Selena Meyer gets a call from her advisor, Ben, who she picks up the phone and he says, ma'am, we have a storm coming in. And she says, is it Israel or is it China?
China.
And he just says, no, it's an actual hurricane.
Yeah. Real hurricanes, yeah.
Yeah.
We got a storm brewing, ma'am.
Is it Israel or is it China?
No, it's an actual hurricane.
But it's just like, you're an American president and you get a call about a crisis, and it's like,
yeah,
is it
like,
Israel?
it's obviously gonna be one of those two factors.
Yeah.
It's like, ooh, ain't gonna be Canada.
No.
Like,
yeah. But like that's part of it too. It's just, that is kind of like Israel's consistent aim. But when the US uses its leverage,
yeah.
Israel tends to have to pay attention. I don't know. So like when we were talking about the 1982 war in Lebanon, Ronald Reagan, US president at the time, Republican, friendly to Israel, called up Menachem Begin and said, the Holocaust that you are perpetrating in Beirut has to stop. That's the word he used, and he basically
I
said,
remember like just reading about that.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like that war was very destructive, very interesting war, and very overlooked and forgotten in the general history. But like when the Americans said time's up, you got to go, then the Israelis left. Also, the first Bush administration put a lot of pressure on the Israelis to start coming to the table for some talks and to stop the really violent repression of the first Intifada from 87 to 93. And George Bush Sr. would often get into like kind of spats with the Israelis and pushing them around, but use the leverage, you get a little more of what you want. The Biden administration clearly hasn't used the right amount of leverage. They haven't used the big.
I'm lost on what Biden's doing. Like, I'm like, Biden, like, what are you doing? And then you like watch him, like, you don't watch him make any speeches anymore. You think he died. Like, it's like, where'd he go? But then it was like, I remember like watching at one point him like openly admitting, like re-admitting that he was a Zionist. I was I'm like, Biden, like, you are president. Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm like, obviously we all know you're senile, but it's like whoever's in charge of your like medical team like needs to up with the drugs, like silence you, like don't allow you to speak. Like, say you had a stroke.
Yeah, do what they did to Reagan.
Like, I don't care. Like, it's like, but do something different. Like, this is not working for you. And I just don't know what Kamala's going to do. Like, I was like obviously not impressed with her stance on like what's happening right now and her opinions on it. Trump's obviously just like totally fucked. Like, we all know he's going to just be like out to lunch, like right up Netanyahu's ass, like buddy.
Yeah.
So it'll be terrifying.
Although he may say, stop it as well.
Yeah, you and then he could also like just like the wind could blow right, and he'd be like, I feel like today let's free all the prisoners that are Palestinians, just like give the land back. He'd be like, what? Like, it was like when he like all of a sudden had an opinion on Venezuela, and everyone was like, is he going to be like the voice of reason? It was like, no, this man made no difference at all. Like,
definitely not.
People are still in trouble. But
yeah, so I mean, it's frustrating because you see the Americans, their strategy is basically we arm Israel, we support their war aims, even if they're genocidal, because that's never really stopped the Americans in the past.
Backfire on the U.S. down the line, like, you don't think
this has backfired on the U.S. unbelievably already globally?
Yeah, like it's like so what are they doing? Like, take a different stance.
That's the thing. Like, this is not a thought out strategy. This is
that's
America.
Why they look like puppets. Like, that's why. Because I'm like, you guys used to be smarter than this. Like, what's happened?
They look like puppets, but they're in their reflexive position. Like, this is the standard operating procedure. They don't realize how much things have changed.
Yeah.
They don't realize that like the whole world sees this now for what it is. And America's reputation is just like plummeting to the depths of the earth and subterranean.
Like, you can't get out of this one. Like, no one respects you.
And nobody believes anything they say. And if they ever open their mouths and say anything about human rights or point at Putin or point at China and say this or that, then the entire world is going to say, WTF, guys, have you heard of Israel?
Yeah.
because nobody trusts anything they say anymore. And this has always been like the thorn in the side of their reputation consistently, apart from all their individual wars around the world. But like, this is probably potentially even more damaging than the Iraq War.
Oh my God.
To U.S. reputation.
Who would have thought that was going to happen?
Yeah, and Vietnam was similar. It was a huge hit.
Honestly, Bush is probably just like sitting back, being like, "Thank God." Like he's like, somebody's taking the heat off old me.
And Dick Cheney's probably sitting back, being like, "I'm so jealous. I want to kill people too."
Yeah, he's like, "I'm going back up." Like, it's like seniors club. Like he's probably like thinking like his lottery's coming. Like, he's like,
and meanwhile, George Bush is just sitting there painting paintings of his dog, which is what he does these days.
It's like crew. Like it's like this group of people.
All war criminals.
And so, what do you think though with all this stuff brewing, right? We now have like Lebanon and all this is heating up. Obviously, like Iran is like likely to make it at least like a declaration or a stance. You have the U.S. election coming up. You have like the pressures on getting more on Netanyahu. We have like the potential of an actual like warrant. Like, what do you think is going to happen? I guess you kind of already answered it. Like, you think it's going to get worse?
100%. I mean, it's. I would love to be shocked with an announcement of a ceasefire and a de-escalation, even if it's just 21 days, a couple weeks, just something, a break in the brutality. Like, obviously, that's not remotely enough. Like, you need a permanent ceasefire, you need the war to end, you need everything Israel is doing to end, like sanctions, like just like Israel needs to be totally excluded. Like, what was done to apartheid South Africa needs to be amplified and done to Israel many, many times over. Boycott, divestment, sanctions, cut relations, isolate it, arms embargoes, like all these things, arrest warrants for pretty much its entire leadership. Like it really needs to face repercussions for its actions. None of that is in the near term. I think the near term is really grim. And I think they're clearly escalating their war. They're following the same strategy they followed in the first few weeks in Gaza. They're sending out, their text messages. They're telling them to evacuate, them being the Lebanese. They're telling the Lebanese to evacuate southern Lebanon. They've issued orders to evacuate Dahiya and other neighborhoods in Beirut. They're continuing their massive bombing campaigns, mass casualties, mass destruction. Once again, implementing the Dahiya Doctrine of disproportionate force. Yeah. This is going to escalate in the region. We're going to see. It's hard to imagine Iran, Syria sitting out of it while one of their top allies gets decimated. Israel obviously loves to retaliate, so it's going to do that. It's going to embolden the right wing further. You have Itamar Ben-Gvir, who threatened that if there is a ceasefire signed, he will pull out of the government, and that would collapse the government. Pushed for re-elections. Potentially Netanyahu's gone, so he refuses to sign a ceasefire. Another reason why he refuses to sign a ceasefire.
So unhinged.
Yeah, so
he's
it's
like
really,
got no control. Like in reality, he's really like got no control.
Netanyahu?
Yeah.
I mean, he does, but he has restraints.
Yeah.
And to a degree, I think blaming, because it's something that the Israeli media has repeatedly pointed out over the past year. Anytime that a ceasefire has been close to being negotiated, it's often blamed on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the other right-wingers who threatened to collapse the government, pulling out of the coalition.
Their threats real. See what they would do. The least he could do is still sign it.
I mean, but to a degree, Netanyahu also shares a lot of their beliefs. And Likud, because a lot of his own ministers in Likud share those beliefs. There's a defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who tends to be the more centrist of Likud politician. Yeah, like Netanyahu, he fired him before back in 2023, then had to reinstate him after protests. And he keeps threatening to fire him now and want to replace him with like a more puppet kind of figure closer to Netanyahu. But he's still in the same party. And so I mean, I think there's a degree to which this is the real Netanyahu as well. Yeah. Like this is him being able to do what he really wanted to do, and that these right wingers threatening his government help give him an added excuse to keep waging war, because
Yeah.
if he stops the war and signs the ceasefire, then his career is also over. So
Yeah.
it's not just that these guys are blackmailing him, it's that they are blackmailing him, but their interests are also aligning.
All the same. Yeah.
So, you have all these reasons for the Israelis to continue waging war and to expand the war, not too much holding them back, including America, which likes to make public statements, but isn't using its real leverage, which is that we're going to stop sending you weapons. Because, what was it? America this week saying, oh, we want a 21-day ceasefire, and here, agree to this and do this. And we're making all this.
$8.7 billion in military aid.
There you go. Exactly.
Like, I think Germany actually put an embargo on weapons, didn't they?
Oh, I have to look that up. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd be very surprised.
I feel like I saw that.
I'll have to check into that.
Actually, I'm just going to check right now.
But I mean, yeah, like the U.S. loves to, play the public relations game. We are encouraging them to show restraint. We're pushing tirelessly for a ceasefire, but never threatening to withhold weapons, or never withholding the weapons, which would actually force Israeli behavior to change.
Yeah, so Germany denies that it's stopped, but like expert sources are saying that they have slowed down and are stopping their approval for war weapons to export to Israel.
Interesting.
But I feel like they're probably getting pressure from like the UK, because also the UK's tune has changed, right? So now it's like
degree.
Yeah, I mean, like surface level, right? Like they're more vocal now, like being like, we're not for this. Like they're like trying to be all like, we don't agree. Like we all know that's like Trudeau tried to do it too, and now it's like, where's fucking Trudeau?
Yeah, but I mean, these are also like just these countries trying to avoid public relations disasters.
Yes, exactly. Whereas, like, I feel like that's exactly it. So it's like I feel like I need a little bit more.
Here's my totally biased historian perspective. Don't trust the Germans.
Yes, dude. I mean, of course. I was saying this to my mother the other day. I was like, it's so sad. And it's not sad. I mean, like, I know, like, statistically, a majority of Israelis actually, like, really agree with what's going on. Like, and some of them want it to actually get worse. But for those who don't, and for those who, like, really just, like, don't want this, they're going to wander now with a stain, right? So it's, like, just like Germans do, and there are people out there that don't agree. So it's, like, and now it's, like, going to be, it's, like, just such a glaring moment where you really realize politicians don't actually care about their people. Like, even you like watch what is happening right now in Lebanon. Like, it's like if there is a retaliation from Hezbollah, which there will be, like it's not going to be like Netanyahu and them that get injured in this situation. It's going to be civilians. Like it's constant. It's never ending.
Yeah.
They're constantly putting them in harm's way. And if they're doing it with Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, like they don't care about civilian life. Like, and it's just becoming so like blaringly obvious that if you can't even see it as an Israeli, it's like really, I feel sad for you. Like it's like your fate sucks. Like
truly, yeah. And yet you still hear all these lies being repeated.
Yeah.
Time and again.
Well, just like look at it, like I sit and think to myself, I watch the German police and I watch like the military like forces that are being implemented in certain areas when there's larger like protests, and it's like look at what you're doing. Like it's like, oh my gosh, like it's just so difficult to even see, because it's like you literally are right back in it doing exactly what you did before. You think you're doing good, but you're just not. Like you're not. Like you're on the wrong side of history again.
Yeah.
Like ugh. Like it's like body.
I know I've said this a few times already, but like we got to do an episode on Germany, and
for sure.
Specifically the rise of the far right AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. They're basically a neo-Nazi party that are becoming quite popular in Germany, and starting to become first in several state elections just in the past few weeks.
It's just so scary, because I feel like all of a sudden it's like we're this moment in the world where fascism and like dictatorship is like in a rise, and it's like scary.
Yeah, fascism, dictatorship, pandemics, increased war, repression, uprising, protests, autocracy, economic crisis, uncertainty, austerity, all these things. It sounds like I'm describing the period between the 1910s,
Yes.
20s,
We're about to live
30s,
through
and
that.
40s, except we're all just encompassed or compressed rather into like the 2010s and 2020s.
Yeah.
So, like it's often said that history repeats. That's not quite accurate, but there's a better saying that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That's pretty much where we're at. We are in this period of like, we're seeing these patterns that we've seen before take place, and it's kind of all happening at once.
Yeah.
And it's not the same. It's not repeating because the circumstances are different. We have very different technology, very different communications, very different weapons, very different systems and understandings and knowledge and communications. Like we are having this conversation over computers. Like that wasn't happening in 1910,
Yeah.
But so the circumstances are different, but history is rhyming. And so we have to like recognize these patterns in order to try and fuck them up from, continuing, because we saw, looking back at history, where that all went.
Yeah.
It turned into world wars. And that would be great if we could avoid that, because also, unlike the previous two world wars, we now have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And I don't trust any of the countries that have them.
No, me neither. And I'm just like, think of like, it would just be horrifying. It would just be like such an extremely devastating time to live through.
Yeah, I if we live through it.
Yeah.
And on top of all this, we have climate catastrophes.
Yes,
So it's just
literally.
like, wow.
Hurricane Helen just fucking came ripping through.
I mean, millennials, right? Like I feel bad for Gen Z because like we've, as millennials, like kind of got shit, but then Gen Z are just like even worse off.
Dude, Forbes' generation.
Ugh.
I think to myself, what will
Your
be
son.
for you? Like, you might be American.
Oh God, poor guy.
So frightening. I
know.
feel like that is a great place to end it because we made it to
Yes.
143.
Yeah,
That was a good one.
Yeah, I think so. In This Mad World is a podcast from EmpireAndEconomics.com, hosted by Andrew Marshall, that's me, and Chelsey G. Music by Francesco Caruso. Please subscribe, like, and share. Visit EmpireAndEconomics.com. Thank you for listening.